Good evening from Kyoto. I'm Dr. Takeo Saio, practicing physician, one of the organizers of this webinar, a member of COVID-19 Task Force of Japan Association for Bioethics. This is the part 3 of the series of webinar entitled COVID-19 and Bioethics, co-organized with Brazilian Society of Bioethics, chaired by Professor Dishu Greco. Professor Greco is a world well-known professor of infectious disease and bioethics. Today, we discussed about the critical issue of research ethics in the situation of pandemic. All speakers of this webinar played historically important role in the international debates on the related topics of Declaration of Helsinki of the World Medical Association, WMA. It's our great honor, Dr. Ramin Parsi, who chaired the recent revision of the Declaration of Helsinki, and the Secretary General of the WMA, Dr. Otmar Kreiber, are joining us. I hope every one of you enjoy our discussion. So, Professor Greco, could you please start your talk?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good night to all. It's my pleasure, and I think I'm very much honored to be part of this very important meeting. And it's very nice to see some people that I have not been seeing for a long time due to this COVID situation. I'll start saying thank you to Kyoko and Takeo, because they had the most part of this problem to work to do what we're going to have today. And I'm saying all this in the name of the Brazilian Society of Bioethics, which I'll be sharing until the end of this year. And it's very nice to see some people that I know very much. So Professor Imamura, that we have been together discussing Paulo Freire about a year ago. Of course, Kyoko and Takeo were very nice to me, and to Otmar, that's there too. We're together in Japan just before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Good to see you, Ruth. Thank you for accepting. Wolf, my good friend for a long time, since I think last time we saw each other was in 2010. Peter Lurie, good to see you too. A long time no seeing. And all those people that are there. I'm seeing my friends from Brazil, Laís Souza is there, and Tânia Cotrim, who is the chair, the head of our communication at the Brazilian Society, with not keeping your time. I'm giving the floor to Kyoko to start this meeting, and I hope you can be with us next week at the same time. We are going to have another discussion. Thanks again. We hope we have a very good meeting. Hope you all keep safe and healthy, and we'll be keeping fighting against this, not only the COVID, but all the things that are happening together with this very bad situation that's facing throughout the world, including the disparity that's being seen much more than before. Thanks very much. Kyoko and Takeo, thanks.
Hello, everyone. Let me introduce myself. I am Dr. Kyoko Imamura, and I am a project professor of the IT and Social Cooperation Program of IT Healthcare at the Graduate School of Pharmaceutical Sciences of the University of Tokyo. So I'm glad to meet Dr. Greco again. And also our colleagues at WMAs and or ethical societies. And today I'm representing the two organizations. One is the IFAP, International Federation of the Associations of Pharmaceutical Physicians and the Pharmaceutical Medicine. This is a worldwide the group of people trying to promote the pharmaceutical medicine, and we have the ethics working group in our organization, which is strongly driving the ethical conduct of medicines development and the medicines the appropriate use in the market. Kyoko has been the most strongest activist in this ethics working group. And this program has been supported by our organization, IFAP. And also I'm representing its Japanese National Member Association, the JAFMED, Japanese Association of Pharmaceutical Medicine. So I'm really happy to meet you all here in this online meetings this week and next week as well. So today I'm going to help Dr. Saio to moderate all these presentations, and also trying to keep in mind that we need to be strict on the scheduled time. Okay, in the interest of time, I think we better accelerate the presentation. So let me ask Kyoko, who prepared all these events, spending many weeks, I think. Okay, Kyoko, please start your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction. So I will make this slide. Oh, sorry, slideshow. Okay. Sorry. Excuse me. Okay, so thank you for your introduction, and hello everyone. Thank you for your participation. I'm very, very happy to meet with all of you. I'm Kyoko Kurihara, one of the organizers, COVID-19 Task Force of the Japan Association for Bioethics. My presentation is a collaborative work of this Japanese group. Kyoko is one of the authors, and Takeo is also authors, and Kotone Matsuyama, she is also the member of the working group of ethics in IFAP. And our presentation will make some proposals for the future revision of the Declaration of Helsinki, focusing on placebo and post-trial access, especially considering the global experience of this pandemic. There is no conflict of interest. First, we describe about justice principle in bioethics. Ethics of placebo-controlled trials and post-trial access is related to justice principle of bioethics. Japanese government is going to purchase COVID-19 prevention vaccines to cover its whole population without participating in phase 3 placebo study. This is against the justice principle. Some vaccines have been proven to be effective at half a year from the vaccination in high-risk populations, but have not been proven in Japan. In the world pandemic situation, morbidity and mortality is higher in American and European continents, but lower in Eastern Asian countries. High efficacy rates of some vaccines at 6 months from vaccination have been shown in phase 3 studies and real-world evidence. There is just one concern in BMJ on this high efficacy rate. Placebo studies have been conducted in high prevalence areas. There is no participation from Japan, but the Japanese government is going to purchase vaccines to cover its whole population. This is against the principle of justice. There are Chinese vaccines, not so high efficacy rate, but some people of some countries can access only to these vaccines. There are many countries of no access to effective vaccines, and there is a scientific compelling reasons to continue placebo studies to prove longer time efficacy, longer time safety, efficacy for some specific populations. We have to find ethical principles to provide effective vaccines for people who need it in the world. discussion on the Declaration of Helsinki will provide driving force. So next, we discuss about placebo study after emergency use authorization. The Declaration of Helsinki states that new intervention must be tested against best proven intervention. There have been arguments that if this best proven intervention is not available in some community, this principle is not applicable. This idea is against the justice principle when placebo study is conducted in no access areas and only the rich countries can purchase the product proven to be effective. For this reason, the principle of best proven intervention must be strengthened. Actually, because of some scientific compelling reasons to continue phase 3 placebo study under emergency use authorization, the study design was changed. Participants come to be able to switch from a placebo to active group when they became eligible for vaccination in their condition. WHO stated last December that emergency use authorization does not in itself render the best proven intervention in the Declaration of Helsinki or establish the effective intervention in CIOM's guidelines. However, actually, worldwide rollout of vaccines is based on the fact that half-a-year efficacy has been proven. The WHO experts also stated that countries with limited or no access to an effective vaccine could ethically permit placebo-controlled trials. This is against the principle of the Declaration of Helsinki. New intervention must be tested against the best proven intervention in the world. This WHO's statement is similar to the French doctor's statement that the WHO protested against. In April of the last year, this French doctor posed a provocative question: why not conduct vaccine study in Africa, where there are no masks, no treatment? To avoid such confusion, the meaning of the best proven must be clarified as it means a best proven intervention in the world. The Declaration of Helsinki does not permit placebo study on the ground of no access in the host countries. Still now, there is a scientific compelling reason to conduct placebo studies. It can be permitted in lower prevalence areas or on some specific untested populations. It should be also clarified that the best proven in the world means the best proven on some specific populations. There is a remaining questions about the risk threshold. In the situation where there is a best proven intervention in the world, the Declaration of Helsinki permits placebo study if it does not cause additional risks of serious or irreversible harm. This risk threshold is questionable because CIOM's guidelines took this wording in their 2002 version, but it changed in its 2016 revision to minor increase above minimal risk. We should discuss more about this risk threshold in terms of a physician's obligation to prioritize the patient interest to the goal of research, which is a core principle of the Declaration of Helsinki. So next, we discuss about post-trial access. The Declaration of Helsinki states that in advance of a clinical trial, sponsors, researchers, and host country governments should make provisions for the post-trial access for all participants who still need an intervention identified as beneficial in the trial. This information must also be disclosed to participants during the informed consent process. There are some problems. This is a mixture of obligations of sponsors, researchers, and governments. It mentions obligations only in advance of a clinical trial. So what about post-trial? post-trial access should be assured not only for participants, but also host community, then people who need it in the world. In case of COVID-19 prevention vaccines, sponsors assures post-trial access not only for study participants, but also for people who need it in host countries, as well as people in the world. Obligation of individual researcher is to provide best available care to study participants at the completion of the study. Host country government, which have invested substantial public money, collaborating with all related stakeholders, healthcare workers, study participants, have been struggling to meet their ethical obligations to achieve global access. For example, waiver from certain provisions of TRIPS agreement has been discussed to overcome obstacle of intellectual property rights. The biggest progress is a statement from the US to support the proposal from developing countries. Japanese Companies Association protested against it, worrying about uncontrolled manufacturing and supply without assurance of safety and quality. But this is a questionable statement because safety, quality, and supply are not controlled by patent system, but controlled by pharmaceutical regulations. The United States Operation Warp Speed achieved rapid development of effective vaccines. Now, global version of Operation Warp Speed is needed. It should be collaborated with NGOs and governments of low and middle income countries. This paper is not about COVID-19. It shows lower rate of product approval in lower income countries that hosted clinical trials, comparing higher rate of product approval in higher income countries that hosted clinical trials. So this is our proposals, not only to assure post-trial access to study participants, but also we should assure fair access for people who need it in host country and then in the world. It is not enough to provide information of post-trial provision to ethics committee and candidate participants. Post-trial provisions should be discussed involving relevant stakeholders in order to actually achieve post-trial access in health system of each country and in the world. This is a finding from the experience of the world pandemic, but it is applicable to all human studies. So thank you for your attention. And we would like to appreciate these professors to discuss these topics continuously. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kyoko. Now, is there anyone who wants to make special comments to Kyoko's presentation?
Can I suggest that the comments could be after the three speakers?
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to listen to your comment, and Professor McLean and Professor Lully will be the discuss as same kind of topic. So I would like to listen to the comments from the WHO after that. It will be very nice. Thank you very much. So I will stop sharing. And next.
Okay, then let us ask Dr. Ruth McLean to start her presentation.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I didn't get the whole screen. Okay, and can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to begin, and in fact, there is considerable overlap with the presentation that you just heard, and that's in part because I was asked to give an overview of these two topics. So I will, sometimes things bear repeating, and after Chiko's excellent presentation, I will add some comments, but include very many of the same points. So the two key ethical issues that we're discussing today, these are not the only ethical issues, but they're certainly important ones. And this is the acceptability of placebo controls, because there have been some recommendations even for ongoing research that there be placebo controls. And here the difference is between countries with wide access to vaccines that are already approved for emergency use, and on the other hand, countries with limited or no access to vaccines that have already been approved for emergency use. And I am using this phrase, approved for emergency use, because it's at least as of the time of my preparation of these slides, all of the 7 or 8 vaccines that are currently in use throughout the world, none of them have been approved for anything but emergency use. Now, I may be mistaken about that for the Sinovac in China, but certainly the ones that have been approved by the European Union Medical Association and the United States FDA have been approved only for emergency use. And that means the vaccines can be used, but they are not yet licensed. The second topic, post-trial benefits. I'll say a few words about the COVAX agreement, which was forged and proposed in order to ensure access to vaccines on the part of middle and low-income countries, but there are some flaws and difficulties. And then the question is, whose obligation is it? And this will bring us back to the Declaration of Helsinki and the SIOM's international guidelines. So let's say a few more things about placebos in research. Obviously, as everyone knows, use of placebos can be controversial in research with human beings. And the two well-known and highly respected international ethical guidelines provide guidance on placebos. And those are, of course, the Declaration of Helsinki from the World Medical Association in its most recent iteration in 2013, and the SIOM's International Ethical Guidelines for Health-Related Research Involving Human Beings, and that was 2016 in collaboration with the World Health Organization. I could say more about those two documents since I know them very well, and I should add that I was a member of the work group that issued the SIOM's International Ethical Guidelines. And those were done, I wouldn't say in collaboration, but in close association with the World Medical Association, since the active participants who worked on the Declaration of Helsinki in 2013 were present at all of the meetings of the SIOM's group that was working on the 2016 guidelines. Well, we should recall that international guidelines are not legally binding. That is, there is no way of enforcing them because they're not really international laws. However, some countries do incorporate the international guidelines into their own laws. So we have actually seen this, but let's go through it again quickly. Paragraph 33, use of placebo in the Declaration of Helsinki. The benefits, risks, burdens, and effectiveness of a new intervention must be tested against those of the best proven intervention, except in the following circumstances: where no proven intervention exists, the use of placebo or no intervention is acceptable, or, and here we heard these words in Chieko's presentation, where for compelling and scientifically sound methodological reasons, the use of any intervention less effective than the best proven one, the use of placebo or no intervention is necessary to determine the efficacy or safety of an intervention. and the patients who receive any intervention less effective than the best proven one, placebo or no intervention, will not be subject to additional risks of serious or irreversible harm as a result of not receiving the best proven intervention. Well, there are a lot of words and phrases in there that require unpacking, as we say, or elaboration and discussion. What are the compelling and scientifically sound reasons? What are interventions less effective than placebo? And what are the additional risks of serious or irreversible harm? And how serious does the harm have to be? So those are some of the considerations that have to be interpreted and discussed. So here's one example that's in the literature of what is a compelling and scientifically sound methodologic reason why you might have to use a placebo in order to get a clear result in a study. And that is, some diseases have the characteristic of being exacerbating and remitting. Multiple sclerosis is one of those, or one version, one form of multiple sclerosis. So what that means is that the strength of symptoms of the disease or condition increases and decreases naturally, not with regard to a treatment, but that's the characteristic of the disease. So the argument is, without a placebo control, it would not be clear whether the experimental treatment works or the disease symptoms subsided on their own. So, I mean, that I think is a clear example of where a placebo might be needed in order to get a clear result for a study. However, as we know, this is not the case with COVID-19. The second question is, what counts as serious harm? Patients may have a different view from that of researchers of what is considered serious. There's an old humorous saying in the discussion of what is minor surgery, the answer that in this humorous saying is, minor surgery is surgery on someone else. So that's sort of the same as serious, determine in whose eyes is it serious. Here is the CIOMS Guideline 5 on the same point. As a general rule, the Research Ethics Committee must ensure that research participants in the control group receive an established effective intervention. These are different words. Helsinki uses best proven, CIOMS uses established effective, but it's really meant to convey the same idea. Placebo may be used as a comparator when there is no established effective intervention for the condition, or when placebo is added on. So that's an add-on, and that's not our issue here. CIOMS guideline continues, when there is an established effective intervention, placebo may be used as a comparator without providing the established effective intervention, only if there are compelling scientific reasons for using placebo, and delaying or withholding the established effective intervention will result in no more than a minor increase above minimal risk to the participant, and risks are minimized, including through the use of effective mitigation procedures. Well, what is a minor increase above minimal risk? That is a difficult concept to quantify. And as a member of the work group that worked on CIOMS, we had many, many debates. Dirceo Greco can attest to this, many debates and discussions about the meaning of that phrase and whether it's useful. So people disagree, for example, about what constitutes minimal risk, and therefore they are similarly likely to disagree over what counts as a minor increase. So that is clearly something that would need to be worked out and agreed upon. So an article that appeared, and here's the footnote to this, Chico's presentation already mentioned this article. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The authors were external experts brought together by the WHO, and there were 3 WHO staff, including the principal scientist from WHO on that committee. The article argued that, and this was in the New England Journal of Medicine, the article argued that new vaccine research should be carried out in countries lacking access to COVID-19 vaccine already approved in other countries. And the article says, while this is ethical or still ethical and feasible. And that's an assumption that is not clearly argued in the article. The purpose, the authors claim, of the placebo-controlled study is to obtain pivotal data to improve regulatory and public health decision-making. Well, the article and the proposal in there to use placebos when there does exist an effective and highly effective vaccine violates a long-standing practice in research to do one of two things. Either stop the placebo-controlled trials when a successful product is available, not only not to start them, but also to, in fact, to stop them when a successful product is available outside the trial, or inform the trial participants that there is a proven treatment, enabling them to leave the trial and possibly, in some cases or in many cases, to obtain the vaccine. However, as we know, vaccines are currently available in poor countries only, this is the COVID vaccine, only to a very limited number of people. So if sponsors seek to test new vaccines in those countries using placebo controls, then it constitutes what we call a double standard. One standard for rich countries and another standard for poor countries. It takes advantage of the inhabitants' lack of access to existing vaccines, and probably the strongest condemnation of that practice is to say not only is it using a double standard, but it is a form of exploitation of people in lower and middle income countries. So the proposal in the New England Journal violates the guidelines. It violates the provisions in the Declaration of Helsinki. Participants in the placebo group would be subject to additional risks or serious irreversible harm as a result of not receiving the vaccine. And the serious and irreversible harm is obviously infection with the virus for COVID-19. And in SIOMs, delaying or withholding the established effective intervention, that is the vaccine, will likely result in more than a minor increase above minimal risk to the participant. And of course, in the case of COVID-19, that is the possibility of serious illness or death. Interestingly, the New England Journal article's violates the WHO's own policy. And Kyoko did not mention this in hers, so this is goes beyond everything that I've just said that overlaps and repeats what her presentation has given. The WHO website says, and anybody can go to the website and confirm what I've written here, the Ethical Review Committee at WHO is guided, that's called the ERC, is guided in its work by the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki, as well as the International Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research Involving Human Subjects, SIOMS 2016. So that is the review body that reviews all research that is submitted to WHO, and that's the World Health Organization's Ethical Review Committee. In the United States, it's called IRBs, and the rest of the world, ERCs or REC, sometimes, Research Ethics Committees. The SIOMS publication, that is the SIOMS most recent guidelines, cites WHO as a collaborator in drafting its guidelines. That is, in the publication itself, SIOMS, it says, prepared by SIOMS in collaboration with WHO. And again, dear Saio Greco can attest to this. At all of the meetings of the work group, the SIOMS work group, there were key members of the WHO who were present. And in reviewing the final document, there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussion between the WHO members who were present, and the document, the entire SIOMS document was reviewed by the Research Ethics Committee. So it's quite clear that there were members, this was an expert group with members of WHO who wrote this article in the New England Journal, and they violated WHO's own claims. So the question here is, how could 3 WHO staff members who served on the expert group of authors convened by WHO conclude that it is still feasible and ethical to conduct a placebo-controlled trial when vaccines for COVID-19 have become available? Were they not familiar with the WHO Ethical Review Committee's adherence to the Declaration of Helsinki and SIOMS? Were they relying on the excuse that the currently available vaccines had received only emergency use approval? And as I mentioned earlier, that may be a key point in the argument here. 8 different vaccines currently have received such approval and are now in use in much of the world. They are not yet licensed, but can they still be thought of or called experimental? So, all right, I'm continuing. I hear some speaking. I'll continue. Let me turn to post-trial benefits now for the second half of my presentation. It's more than half, actually. The Declaration of Helsinki and SIOMS both address providing successful results of research to trial participants and others. Well, it's certainly clear that wealthy countries can afford to purchase COVID-19 vaccines, but many lower and middle income countries cannot. The result then is an inequitable balance of available vaccines in the world. Here's what the Declaration of Helsinki says. In advance of a clinical trial, sponsors, researchers, and host country governments should make provisions for post-trial access for all participants who still need an intervention identified as beneficial in the trial. This information must also be disclosed to participants during the informed consent process. So it's clear from this that the benefits, according to the Declaration of Helsinki, the benefits are limited to trial participants, and there's no mention in this paragraph of benefits to others in the country where the trial is conducted. Now, Kyoko also mentioned that this paragraph mentions sponsors, researchers, and host country governments, and it doesn't say, nor could it, because the Declaration of Helsinki is intentionally a brief document, and these are things that would have to be worked out by these parties. But the question here is, who has the most obligation? How the researchers have an obligation? Are they supposed to take money out of their pockets? Obviously not. The sponsors are very often, but not only, pharmaceutical industry, which of course has a lot of money, and host country governments may be very poor governments or in poor countries. So that is obviously a detail that would have to be worked out. SIOM's guideline 2 on this point is entitled Research Conducted in Low Resource Settings. So note that this does not apply, or it's not intended to apply, to the United States, to countries in Western Europe, to Japan, etc. Before instituting a plan to undertake research in a population or community in low resource settings, the sponsor, researchers, and relevant public health authority must ensure that the research is responsive to the health needs or priorities in the communities or populations where the research will be conducted. Well, that part is simply designed to say, don't do research in a poor country on a topic or a subject or a disease that doesn't exist in that country, because there'll never be any benefits to that population. Additional points in the SIOM's guidance: as part of their obligation, sponsors and researchers must also make every effort in cooperation with government and other relevant stakeholders to make available as soon as possible any intervention or product developed and knowledge generated for the population or community in which the research is carried out. So unlike the Declaration of Helsinki, SIOMS calls for providing post-trial benefits to the wider population in the country or the community. That is to say, it's not limited to trial participants only. There's a lot to say about this, but we can I hope if we have time, discuss it. Now let me say a few words about the COVAX Global Initiative. It's a newly formed initiative, specifically because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The initiative was led by WHO an organization, a global organization called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, Gavi. UNICEF is a partner, but not quite as central as the other three, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI, which is a newly formed organization after this pandemic began. At least 184 nations signed on to this COVAX program. I tried to get the latest number, but I didn't get a clear answer to that. Someone might know the answer. So the aims of this initiative, the COVAX Global Initiative, are to accelerate the development and manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines, guarantee fair and equitable access for every country in the world. However, high-income countries, they didn't exactly violate it, but they went around the agreement. They signed on to the agreement, but then they circumvented the agreement by making contracts with vaccine manufacturers. And then these high-income countries, the United States was clearly one of them, they stockpiled vaccines for their own citizens, resulting in inequitable access. And this has come to be known as vaccine nationalism. So a movement currently exists. This is a movement to expand the availability of vaccines. A movement currently exists to eliminate patent protections for COVID-19 vaccines. This was also mentioned in Kyoko's presentation. Vaccine manufacturers, for obvious reasons, oppose the idea, and many public health advocates are in favor. The US government supports waiving patent protections for COVID vaccines, and this is a historic move by the United States. This is President Biden. It's the administration that supports it. I'm not so sure about those Republicans in the United States. So both of these issues, I'm stopping a little bit early to leave more time. These two ethical issues, both topics addressed in this presentation, will be elaborated further by other speakers in these two international programs. I want to thank everyone for their attention, and I look forward to our discussion together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Now let me invite Dr. Peter Lurie as the next presenter. Dr. Lurie?
Good morning.
Okay, good.
Somehow we're at least ahead of the time that I thought we would be at. So I apologize for that. I'm glad I heard you. Thank you, Dr. Kurihara, for inviting me, and Dr. Saio for inviting me to talk. I'm honored to be among such folks and to revisit this very important ethical question, and to see it raised in such a thoughtful and thorough way. So with that, let me share my screen and get going. You move, sorry, caught me slightly unawares. And I think that does the job, right?
Yep.
Someone confirm we're good? Ruth, we're good?
Yep.
Okay. So it was suggested.
Sorry, is it okay that the next slides can be seen?
Yeah, we see
no problem.
2 pages.
Yeah. But if you don't mind,
yeah,
it's
if
okay.
you click on the display settings and then duplicate the display, then it would get to where you want to be.
Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
we trusted it before and it didn't seem to do that. So I want, is it this? Does this do better?
Yeah, put it onto PowerPoint, put it onto presentation, and then at the top there is display setting, and then if you click on duplicate view.
Is that good?
We are not seeing the slides
Yeah,
yet.
it's not sharing at all. Oh dear. Hold on. Oops. I think, sorry, I do apologize. Part of the confusion is I have two screens, and that's definitely part of the problem here. But let's try, is it, oh dear. Not sure if that's any better. Let's
Oh,
just,
that's good.
yeah, that is good?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I do apologize. Okay. So I think that we were asked to give a little bit of a profile of ourselves as by way of introduction. My name is Peter Lurie, as you see. I did some of the initial work on this when I was with a public interest group named Public Citizen, after which I spent about 8 years at FDA. And now I'm back in the NGO sector with a different group called the Center for Science in the Public Interest, which is where I work now. The SIOM's guidelines and the Declaration of Helsinki have been well covered already. And so I thought what I would do was to try and put this debate in the context of concrete historical examples. And so what I'm going to do is talk about 3 examples of clinical trials that have raised these kinds of ethical questions. The first is the perinatal HIV prevention with zidovudine case. The second is the treatment of respiratory distress syndrome with surfaxin. And myself and my colleague, Dr. Sidney Wolf, brought these first 2 to public attention when we were in Public Citizen. And then I'm going to compare these 2 circumstances against this third one, which is our current circumstance with respect to COVID-19 vaccines. I'm going to work from the assumption, I suppose, that at least many people on this call have concluded that these 2 circumstances were in fact not consistent with prevailing ethical standards at the time or now, and use that as a kind of a comparator group, if you will, a non-placebo comparator, so that we can compare that to our current situation with COVID-19 vaccines. And I'll compare them in 4 different ways. One, the risk of placebo use, i.e. the risk of not getting an effective intervention, the presence of alternative study designs or the lack thereof, the existence of constraints on product availability, and whether something called the constancy assumption has been met. And that relates really to the feasibility of alternative study designs. So I'll start off with a review of these other fairly well-known cases. This one is especially well-known. This one with surfaxin, I think much less so, but in some ways easier to understand and more illustrative of the problem. So if we start with the perinatal case, we start here, as we always do in these kinds of debates, with the basics of what we know about product effectiveness. And in this case, we're looking at a placebo-controlled trial, excuse me, that was done with HIV-positive pregnant women in the early 1990s, using the drug zidovudine or AZT, with an object of preventing HIV transmission from the pregnant woman to her fetus. And at the time, there was no intervention known to be effective in preventing that transmission. And so the use of a placebo was ethical. And this is the result of the trial. In the placebo group, there was about a 26% transmission rate to the infant. In the treated group, it was down all the way to 8.3%. And this is actually a very striking degree of efficacy. And I'll make the argument in a moment, probably about as effective as any intervention in the history of medicine. I would go so far as to say that for reasons that I'll give in a moment. But these are the clinical trial data. Now, Dr. Wolf and myself got interested in this when I made a trip to West Africa and heard about a placebo-controlled trial that was being done in Cote d'Ivoire in the years after the initial placebo-controlled trial, which I should say took place in the United States and France. And there we learned that there was a placebo-controlled trial. The idea was that the regimen proved effective in the original US-France trial would be unaffordable in developing countries. And so if one could develop a less costly intervention, an easier to administer intervention, that would be of benefit to people in developing countries, which I think is true. The question really was, what clinical trial design would you use in trying to identify this putatively less expensive and effective intervention? And what we discovered ultimately was that there were a large number of studies that were being conducted in the aftermath of the original trial in the United States and France. 2 of them were being conducted in the United States. And in those 2 trials, in each case, active controls were being used. So no placebo was being used in 2 out of 2. In the developing world, however, there were 16 trials, and in 15 out of 16, a placebo or some other intervention not known to be effective was being employed. So this is the double standard right here on a single slide. Do one thing in the United States and simultaneously do something very different in the rest of the world. These studies were funded by very well-known institutions like the United States Centers for Disease Control, United States National Institute of Health, the World Health Organization itself. One of the interesting aspects of this was that there was, in fact, one trial which did not use a placebo-controlled trial, and that was done by a group from Harvard with NIH money operating in Thailand. And to cut to the chase a little bit, this is the result of their trial. What they did was, instead of using a placebo, they had 4 different arms of AZT. So the idea of long and long has to do with the duration of AZT administration prior to delivery and then after delivery. So long and long means for a long time before and a long time after. And then you have long, short, short, long, short, short. And from these, you can see that there was, quite clearly effectiveness, remembering that the historical control from the earlier trial had a transmission rate of 25%. So these were well below those. And indeed, when the CDC study, unfortunately, was completed with its placebo group, the transmission rate in the placebo group was about 19%. So all of the difference between this and here, all of this is all protection that was denied to the people in the other trials. These people were protected because they got some version, at least, of the regimen. But all the people who were in placebos were losing this degree of effectiveness, and seeing as though the infection was invariably fatal at that point, the consequences are clear. This design, of course, allowed a very nice comparison between different strategies with different prices and different degrees of toxicity as well. So that's the first example, and as I say, the one somewhat better known. A less well-known one, which, as I said, some people are able to understand more readily, is this one involving a drug company called Discovery Laboratories in the United States. And I say it's easier for people to understand because one reason that people, I think, did not see the ethical problems in the perinatal trials was because they were done by people who were inarguably trying to help out people in developing countries. And I would never contest that. They were well-intentioned people trying to make a difference in resource-poor settings. People found it easier to understand this example because there was a clear profit motive involved. Really the way there is in the situation now with COVID-19, because these are all private companies, seeking profit ultimately. So the product is a product called Surfaxin, which is one of a series of surfactants, which are products instilled into the lungs of neonates and which can help the lung inflate if they have a condition called respiratory distress syndrome, which has a very high mortality. At the time of this study, which was about, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the study that I'm going to discuss, there were already 4 surfactants on the market in the United States. And extraordinarily, there was so much research that there had already been a meta-analysis done, which showed a 34% relative reduction in neonatal mortality, we point out, mortality, compared to placebo. And a review in the New England Journal of Medicine stated that without doubt, this was the most thoroughly studied new therapy in neonatal care. Despite this, well, you'll see what happened despite that fact pattern. The Cochrane went on to say that further placebo-controlled trials are no longer warranted. And in an internal meeting, the FDA stated that conduct of a placebo-controlled surfactant trial for premature infants with respiratory distress syndrome is considered unethical in the USA. So the company, needed a way to bring this product to market, and one thing they did was conduct a study in Europe, which perhaps unsurprisingly did not have a placebo group. It was considered to be an equivalency or non-inferiority study. We'll talk about that in a moment, in which surfactant was compared to one of the 4 already approved surfactants. So that's your design in Europe. This is a quite interesting slide because it shows the history of the development of these, I guess by this point, 4 surfactants, right? And you can see that the original studies, and this is all the 4 of them, combined, it's not by a particular product. You can see that the early studies in 85, 87, 88, all of them use placebo controls. And then, starting somewhere in the early 90s, you start to see non-inferiority or other non-placebo controlled trials cropping up. A couple of exceptions in 95, but after that, nobody's doing placebo controlled trials anymore. And yet, here in 2001, we have a company proposing to set back the ethical clock, I suppose you could say, about 10 years by conducting the study on the ground that it's taking place in a developing country. So the FDA convened a meeting to discuss this, and somebody leaked us the internal documents from that meeting, and it showed just how unthinking people can be when they consider this discussion. The name of the meeting was "Use of Placebo Controls in Life-Threatening Diseases, is the developing world the answer?" Somebody needs a little bit of help in deciding what their meetings ought to be called. The study of the location was actually quite unclear. These were some countries that were mentioned as potential candidates, but really it was a protocol in search of a location, and made, I think, a mockery of the argument that we sometimes hear, which is that the local people want this trial. And we can discuss that issue in some length in the discussion section of this. And obviously, by now, it's clear that the design of the study, as proposed, was surfactant versus a placebo. So that was that trial. I should add that we brought this to public attention, and the placebo-controlled trial never happened. Study was redesigned. They found a way to prove effectiveness, and to my understanding, the product eventually came to market, despite the lack of a placebo control. So let's turn to vaccines for COVID-19. And first, I'll give you some background on those. Many of you will be familiar with this. And then I'll go through the exercise of comparing these 3 situations to, there's 2 situations to COVID-19. So there are 17 vaccines that are now authorized in at least 1 country. A fair number of them are authorized only in their home country. So really there are 8 of them that are sort of substantial presence in the international market, in that they're been authorized in at least 10 countries. And you've heard of most of these 8. There are over 100 countries with at least one authorized vaccine. And as I'll show in a moment, striking degrees of efficacy, up to 95%. Although there have been some safety issues, generally speaking, the safety profiles have been acceptable. And so far, 2 billion doses have been administered. So that's about 26 doses for every 100 people in the world. Of course, some people have gotten 2. But it's a little bit hard, with this amount of vaccine availability to sort of make a blanket argument that there's no available product on an international scale. And if, this is a slide to make any clinical trialist happy. This is the efficacy data on the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And you can see the continuing transmission, the continuing acquisition of moderate to symptomatic COVID, I guess was the outcome, over time in the placebo group. And within about 14 days of the second shot, this is actually after the first shot, you can see that it almost stops completely in the treated group, and this is your 95% effectiveness. And you see essentially the same thing when you look at Moderna. So these are extraordinary efficacy findings, and they both represent an enormous opportunity from a public health point of view, but also at the root of the ethical question that is before us. And this is what global vaccination looks like, where the darker, this greenish color, the larger the larger the fraction of the population that has been vaccinated. You can see clear evidence of a disparity right here on the slide. Most of the per capita rate of vaccination highest in North America, Chile, Uruguay, Europe, China, Mongolia, some countries here in the Middle East, but actually very few countries with nothing. I think probably no countries with nothing. So there's, in places like Brazil, Argentina, there's, a fair amount of vaccination. So it's a little bit hard to make an argument of, complete lack of vaccination. On the other hand, you have Africa in particular, where the rates of vaccination are alarmingly low. And Ruth has gone through some of the reasons why that is the case. So I said I would compare these products on 4 different dimensions. And so this is the first. And this is an attempt to place the risk that I think some of us agreed was unacceptable, all of us, I would hope, actually, agreed was unacceptable in the perinatal case and the Cefaxin case in the context of the currently available vaccines, or at least the first couple of them, the more effective ones. So what I've done over here is I've calculated the difference between the event rates in the treated and the placebo groups. Okay, so you'll remember it was about 25% in the placebo group, transmission in perinatal versus about 8%. So the difference is 17%. And there's an index that many of you will be familiar with, which is the number needed to treat, which is the inverse, 1 over the difference between the 2 groups. And that tells you the number of patients that need to be treated in order to prevent one outcome. And for the perinatal, it was 5.8, which is why I said earlier that I happen to believe that this is the most, really astonishing intervention, perhaps in the history of medicine. For every 6 infants who are treated with, not especially now, expensive intervention, you save a life 1 in 6 times. That is, and this is an infant, right? Who then gets an entire lifespan. If you compare that to things like, interventions for stroke, cardiovascular disease, it's not even remotely in this ballpark. So this is an extraordinarily effective intervention, and makes the provision of a placebo in a trial like that all the more problematic. In the Surfaxin case, the difference between the treated and the placebo in the meta-analysis of earlier trials was 5.2%, and that translates to a number needed to treat of 1. For perinatal and Surfaxin, I'm trying to remember, this was for mortality, this for even in Surfaxin. So these two numbers are the same. The numbers to prevent an event is the same as preventing a death. So again, extraordinary effectiveness here. Now let's turn to the situation with COVID-19. The differences are much smaller. As you know, the sample sizes in these trials are very large, in the tens of thousands. In a group of 10 to 20,000 people, there'll be only a limited number of people in a 2-month period, which is at least the initial period of evaluation for these products, who will acquire the infection, and that's all to the good. But when you look at these differences, which for Pfizer was 0.84% over a 2-month period, Moderna 1.24%, and then you do the math on those, you wind up with a number needed to treat of 119 and 80.6. So you can say about 100, quite a bit higher than these, not enormously higher. But then let's remember that COVID itself is not a fatal infection, and applying just a crude 1 in 100 fatality rate to a case of symptomatic COVID, which was the outcome in these 2 trials, you get a number needed to treat to prevent a death of about 12,000 in this case and about 8,000 in this. So you can say 1 in 10,000. So that says, I think, a couple of things. One is that the risk involved in these vaccine trials is really considerably higher than it was in these 2 cases. But that doesn't answer the question of whether or not this is an acceptable risk. It just places a number on it, and we can have a conversation about whether this is still too high a risk. I probably would argue that it is, but reasonable people can probably disagree over that. Certainly, it's very different than the situation in these 2 earlier cases. Okay, the second dimension on which I wanted to compare these 3 trials has to do with the availability of an alternative study design. And as Ruth indicated with the multiple sclerosis example, there are occasional situations where there's simply no other way to do this, and that would be you don't want research to stop completely. So if in fact there is no alternative design, then the ethical calculus is altered. So I don't want to get into these in a lot of detail, but I will touch on them. In the perinatal example, the alternative design that we put forth was in fact that was used in Thailand. You've already seen the results of it. You've seen that it provided a very convincing display of effectiveness, and in fact was able to unpack the regimen in ways that wouldn't have been possible with a simple placebo control. That used a non-inferiority trial design, and a non-inferiority trial design basically says this new product, the one that you're now testing, is no more than X amount less effective than the already available product. Okay, so you establish this margin, a non-inferiority margin called X, let's call it, which is some amount less than the standard. And if it's not too much less, in other words, if it's less than X, if it's not too much less effective than the standard, then you call it, for all intents and purposes, non-inferior. And from a clinical point of view, this is a product that is suitable for use. And so that was the design that we put forward in the perinatal study. And as I said, it in fact was used in certain cases. In the Surfaxin case, it was a little bit more complicated. There was a non-inferiority trial that was done in Europe, as I pointed out, and that again was evidence of a double standard. There was also a consideration of a superiority trial, and superiority trial is a straight up case where you're comparing two things and you try to prove that your new product is better than the old product. A placebo-controlled trial is a special case of a superiority trial in which the comparator is a placebo. So it was suggested that the company could do a superiority trial in which its product might be proved more effective than one of the existing surfactants. But interestingly enough, the FDA said, quote, a clinical efficacy hurdle that a superiority trial was a clinical efficacy hurdle that the sponsor deems too high for this drug, which I think is a polite way of saying they didn't want to do it that way. So those are the alternative designs for the previous trials, and they crop up again when we start thinking about COVID-19 vaccines. And here, actually, if anything, the alternative designs are greater in number and more diverse. And I'll go through those. So one possibility is a superiority trial, as was considered at least in the surfactant case. Here, the sample sizes are truly formidable, at least if you use the Pfizer or Moderna products as the comparator, because you're looking, as you'll recall from my earlier slides, at 95% effectiveness. It's very hard to be more effective than 95%. That's very hard. And if you wanted to actually prove that, I've not done the sample size calculations, but they would certainly be in the hundreds of thousands and quite possibly even more than that. So that's one option. A second option would be a non-inferiority trial. And this is interesting because when the FDA and the WHO put out their guidance on what would be an effective, an adequately effective COVID vaccine, they stated that the product should be more than 50% effective. So you don't want, minimally effective vaccines on the market. That has not turned out to be a problem, we're happy to say. But it should be greater than 50%. And if you were to use a non-inferiority margin, that X that I referred to earlier would be 10%. I think the problem with those guidances is that they never really contemplated 95% effectiveness. And so, it's one thing to say your product is, let us say, 60% effective, and you don't want X to be more than 10. In other words, no less than 50, right? 60 minus 10 equals 50, right? But it's a totally different thing if you're starting from 95% efficacy. You have much more to sort of give away. And one could imagine a non-inferiority margin, or X, that could be much higher than 10%, say 20%, even 30%. And you would still have a vaccine that, with a high degree of confidence, would be quite effective and more effective than the 50% people originally required. That would require more subjects. There's one study by some eminent statisticians who looked at this, who estimated perhaps 2 to 3 times as many subjects, depending on the exact inputs. But they did conclude that such a design, quote, may enable reliable randomized evaluations of efficacy and safety using a non-inferiority trial design. One caveat, though, is the so-called constancy assumption, which is the idea that the product would be as effective in this new setting as it had been shown to be effective in the old settings. And that assumption, as I'll talk about in a moment, I believe was met in the perinatal and surfactant trials. Here, it's a little bit more complicated, and I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail. A third potential design is a challenge trial. I think most people on this call are familiar with those. That's a situation in which people are intentionally infected with the pathogen. This reduces sample size, it should be said. And the main reason that it reduces sample size is that you don't have to wait for people to be exposed. Most people will not be exposed in a 2-month study, as we can tell from the relatively low incidences of COVID-19 in those large trials. So it takes away the kind of waiting period, if you will, and everybody is exposed, and the results are enormously decreased sample sizes. But of course, it creates a whole set of unique ethical issues of its own, most particularly the lack of consistently effective treatment for COVID-19, and the fact that in a subset of cases the infection will be fatal. So it's a whole issue unto itself. The big hope, I think, in vaccine development is that we will identify what are called correlates of immunity, for example, neutralizing antibodies, in which one could look at simply antibody levels as opposed to infection levels. And that would also reduce sample size and allow products to come to market quicker. To state the obvious, inordinate delays in getting a product to market in the context of a pandemic, is an ethical issue, of itself. Okay. Third dimension, reconsidering product availability. So in the perinatal and surfactant situations, the drugs were largely unavailable. There was very little zidovudine available in Africa, to be sure. I put in a parenthesis noting that even in countries without widespread availability of any of these products, it's highly likely that locally wealthy people were getting access to these products. So you have this disparity that's within countries as well as between countries. As was suggested in the earlier presentations, the lack of availability leads to what is called the standard of care argument, which in effect argues that the lack of local availability results in a situation where the researcher has no ethical requirement to provide anything more than what is locally available. And seeing as though little was available in the perinatal and surfactant studies, in the view of some, that justified the use of placebo. Of course, not in my view, but that was the argument. So let's just ask the question of the product availability circumstance with respect to COVID-19 vaccines. It's a bit more complicated because, laid on top of the usual, I'm sorry to say, disparities between countries and within countries, we do have a legitimate problem, which is that there's the rollout problem, right? So their products are only now being identified as effective. There's the companies are starting small in terms of the number of products that they can produce, and there's an inevitable ramp up in which they improve and more comes to market. But the result is a period, even in the wealthiest countries, where there's not enough vaccine to go around, and there's a prioritization based on public health need that the authorities ought to be making. And I don't think any of us are troubled by that in the context of legitimate shortage, based on non-economic situations, non-economic circumstances. But the problem in COVID-19 is that you have really a mixture of what are true shortages related to lack of production laid on top of those long-standing disparities. And those become essentially impossible to disentangle at a certain point. Because at the end of the day, even a country, let's just say South Africa, where there's a certain amount of vaccine availability, they're in a different place with respect to their public health prioritization because of the underlying disparity in the way that the product is being distributed. So it may be a good ethical decision within a country to, let us say, start with older people. But the reason that they're providing it, let us say, only to older people, whereas in the United States, we're on to vaccinating 12-year-olds, is because of these disparities in economics. And these should not, in my view, be used to justify placebo controls. The last thing I want to touch on is this constancy assumption. Like I said, this is the idea that the product will work as well in the new location, developing country, let us say, as it did in the location where the product was proved to work. That's not really an issue for perinatal and surfactant cases, although I certainly did hear people try to raise it in the perinatal case, arguing that somehow, AZT would lose its effectiveness when it went to West Africa. I never thought that that made much sense, and in the end of the day, it didn't. So it really wasn't an issue, but it is more of an issue in our current circumstance in COVID-19, primarily because of the variants, not because of differences between local populations, but because of the variants themselves. So you have to evaluate the constancy assumption in the context of the characteristics of the vaccine, how prevalent the variances are, the degree of resistance that the variant imposes, and whether or not you have these immune bridging studies, which we don't yet have, but which might get us out of the box altogether. I will point out that this can be a real issue, and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which was effective in studies conducted in Western countries, proved to be ineffective in South Africa, where the B.1.351 variant was prevalent, and presumably that's the reason. So there can be an issue in COVID because of the variants, but in the end, if you're even a country that has some variants, and then you have this question of how much variant and how much, how likely is it that that variant would not respond to the vaccine. In order to justify a placebo, there would have to be true equipoise over whether any vaccine was effective, not just one vaccine that that you thought might not be effective for some biological reason, but you'd really have to believe that there was not anything that people agreed would be effective against COVID before you could justify using a placebo. Obviously, this requires, continuing a reassessment as the variant situation continues to evolve. So I'll put it together, the whole thing, all here on a single slide for you. These are the four dimensions that I examined. These are the three circumstances that I considered. And I'll just summarize it all for you. The risks of placebo use are extremely high, really, in the perinatal and surfactant circumstances, somewhat lower, certainly lower, and a question of whether low enough in the circumstance of COVID-19 vaccines. Alternative designs, I believe, were available in both of these cases, and potentially yes in COVID as well. Certainly yes if we have correlates of immunity. The constraints on product availability were really economic, and clearly so in the perinatal and surfactant cases. In COVID, it's a more complicated combination of both economic and production shortages. And then finally, is the constancy assumption met? Yes, in these two circumstances. Here, mostly yes, but does require ongoing monitoring. So in conclusion, I think that to determine the ethical acceptability of placebo use in a given situation, you have to do a case-by-case assessment. These need to be revised over time. And we need to keep people on their toes as the situation continues to evolve. I will say that shortly prior to this talk, I tried to determine whether or not there are, in fact, placebo-controlled trials going forth at this moment in time, and I found it a little bit hard to do. The Novavax might be such a case. It's hard to tell from clinicaltrials.gov and other databases exactly what's ongoing. They're sometimes not updated. There's probably a distinction to be made between those circumstances where people are actively being injected with either drug or placebo, and those where people are being followed. I think that adds another level of complexity. So I hope that there's a a speaker later in this session that can answer the question more definitively than me. But I hope that this comparison has proved helpful and put the overall ethical debate over here in context. Thank you again for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much. I think that three of these speakers are discussing on the same kind of topic, and the Professor Schmidt is different type. So it will be better to discuss here. And first of all, we would like to ask for the comments from the WMA. Which of you would like to speak first?
Well, I'm not sure whether Ramin wants to speak first or whether you leave it to me.
Well, Otmar, I guess I'll leave it to you, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for this extremely interesting presentations. I really enjoyed it a lot. I especially enjoyed these examples now with the different studies. It really was enlightening. And I took a lot of notes. It really helped also for our future thoughts. I think this will be very helpful for WMA looking forward for a possible revision of the DOH. We don't know yet when this is going to happen. Usually WMA is revising its documents every 10 years, if necessary, even earlier. We heard from Ruth that the last revision was in 2013. And so naturally it would be in 2023 again, which is pretty soon, and probably WMA would start a little bit earlier to be done by then, but we will see. No decision has been made so far. And just as a piece of information, WMA is currently revising its International Code of Medical Ethics, which is also one of the core documents of WMA and a very important one. And we have a large working group working on this, and this, of course, also deals in some paragraphs with clinical research. And we're kind of occupied with that work. And we just had our public consultation. We finished that just a few days ago, and maybe one or two of you have also participated in that public consultation. So I would assume soon enough, WMA will embark on another revision of its DOH, and certainly these two topics are extremely important to look at a little bit in more depth. I can only say that during the last revision, we certainly discussed these 2 points very intensively and comprehensively, and it was pretty difficult to get to that wording we currently have. It was quite a compromise. There were very different points of view. So I have to say I can foresee that it will be quite a challenge again to find revised wording if the new work group then thinks there should be one. But I assume, especially considering the current situation and these very pressing issues, we'll probably make them revisit these 2 paragraphs. I heard what demands or proposals Kyoko made in the very beginning, what kind of new wordings would be possible solutions. I also heard the concerns of Ruth and also now with the examples. I'm pretty excited and looking forward to these discussions. Of course, I don't know how they will develop. I can only say that from my very personal point of view, it is quite questionable if current trials that are still ongoing are in line with these 2 documents, the DOH and the SIOMS. But that's my very personal point of view. I enjoy this discussion now, but I would also like to give Otmar now the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you. And thank you again for having me here today and giving me the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you, Kyoko.
Thank you very much for your comment. And I'd like to ask Dr. Kloiber for your comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kurihara. I think, first of all, from my side also, thanks for these three very interesting presentations, very well done presentations. And I also like very much the different approaches that have been taken by Ruth and Peter, by one a principal approach and one a more pondering approach to the use of the placebos. Yet the questions remain what it is, and I can tell you I'm very happy that we are the body setting the Declaration of Helsinki, but we are not the one who have to judge in the end each and any application of it and any use of the principles with it, which is obviously, as you have shown, quite different. It is also very clear to me, not only after this discussion, but also some of the discussions which we had in the HIV prevention trials, that the Declaration of Helsinki is a little bit weak on the side of prevention research, which is something which we quite obviously have to look into a little bit stronger in the future, and that may be one part of the development that has to come, among other points which we still have to do. Yeah, clearly with a disease that is potentially deadly and having no therapeutic approach to serve patients with that disease, there are big question marks about challenge trials that are out there. And of course, as already said, the use of trials without placebos, especially in poor settings. I would like to remind that in the discussion with our colleagues, especially from resource-poor countries, we extensively discussed the questions of, for instance, additional benefits. Ruth mentioned this as one of the topics that we have discussed, also with the Declaration of Helsinki. And it was something that many of us saw as a possibility to add into the Declaration of Helsinki, but it was rejected very clearly by the representatives coming from the poor countries, because of very obvious reasons that trials easily become into something completely different than research projects, but obviously projects for some to gain profit from this, which is not in relation to the research that has to be done. And finally, it was not taken up. And then there also was clearly the question: is having double standards, is that something acceptable, or should it something acceptable? Because we have discussed these examples of trials that Peter wrote out very elegantly, and I think with a very good analysis that you have done. And it was, again, clearly a very affirmative answer from our colleagues, especially from Africa, saying no double standards at all. And again, I would accept the argument that has been brought up by Peter. The principle is nice, but nevertheless, you have to look into each and every case. But then, to me, it is very important whether a judgment on this and a decision has been taken by sponsors in the rich world in kind of paternalistic way in judging risks and benefits for others, or whether that is, and again, an acceptance by a community that is truly affected and truly takes a decision on that. So the pondering is not only by the mere facts that you have clearly rolled out in the presentation by Peter, but it's also a question to me by community action and whether communities can accept it. No, I don't know. I know all the problems with that. Bringing in an undue interference or an undue incentive by just having a mere opportunity to treatment, which may produce already a problem and an interference that is not acceptable. And in the end, that was the reason, I guess, why we have said no double standards at all in the first place. And that certainly is something that is what is in the Declaration of Helsinki. And I agree with Ruth. That, of course, brings up a number of questions also to the paper issued by WHO that has been there. If I may, I have a question to you, Dr. Kurihara. I have not quite understood What the problem is that the testing has not been done in Japan. I agree with you. There are different horizons you can look for, endpoints you can look for. And of course, we all can say we have endpoints which are extremely short. And we are looking only to a 6-month period, and we are looking only to certain variants of the virus, which may produce a limitation of the applicability of results. Let's put that aside for a moment and let's say that is not the problem, and we accept for the moment in the situation of emergency that we have something which helps us to bridge over the next year in order to reduce the pandemic. Why would it not be acceptable for a country like Japan, or like for my own country like Germany, to say, well, we have good studies in other countries which are comparable, like in the United States or in other European countries, and we accept those results for our own use of the vaccine or authorization of the vaccine without demanding that they have been tested in our country. So I did not understand there the problem which you were depicting there. If I may answer.
Okay. So to say simply, it is possible to accept the result of the tested result and tested in some Western or some developing countries with already efficacy rate was proven, and it is possible for Japanese to accept these results. What I would like to say is there are some things that people want to know. That is, as I said, that long-term efficacy or long-term safety. That's the reason why the Pfizer BioNTech continued placebo study, permitting switching from placebo group to active group. So that is so there is some compelling reason. So Japan and maybe some other Asian countries are not so eager to get vaccine to decrease mortality and morbidity and mortality. So I think it is better for Japanese and other Asian countries to conduct global placebo study to find the longer efficacy or some longer safety assessment. That is my opinion. So it is not because my argument is not the necessary of Japanese people to enter into placebo study is not to get the evidence for ourselves, to produce, to generate something which have not been proven. For this kind of effort, global effort, Japan should take part in. Japanese government thinking only get vaccine for whole population. It is this is against the justice principle that is, which is the point I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think the time is coming. So I think it is better to take a break a little bit before starting the next session. So 3 or 5 minutes, it is possible to take a break. So, and next we will start 10. So 10:42. Okay.
5 minutes.
So thank you, everyone. So take a break. So, Professor Schmidt, are you ready?
Yes.
So please share your slide.
Shall you want me to start straight away?
How is it? Kyoko, is it all right?
Yeah, I think so. People are coming back.
Okay. So please start.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm Ulf Schmidt, modern historian at the University of Hamburg. I hope everybody can hear me. Let's just see. Is that, can you see this, the presentation, Chico?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, okay.
Good. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having invited me here, and thank you for Professor Greco and the Bioethics Societies for this event, which I thought it was a very interesting and very important discussions we've had already this afternoon here in Europe. And I think what I'm going to do is I would hope I will be able to contextualize some of these issues in relation to some of the history, also in relation to the history of biomedical ethics standards, the Declaration of Helsinki and the Nuremberg Code on the one hand, but also some of the issues relating to politics, which have been touched on by some of our previous speakers before. Now, just briefly, what I'm going to sketch out is mostly historical. So I will first go back, and some of this material will be familiar to some of your colleagues and experts here present today, and then move forward and maybe touch on some of these issues which are relevant. Now, the work which I'm discussing here is related to research which I and more than 20 colleagues around the world have been doing over the last couple of years, many of whom are present here today, and which we called ethical research, in which we try to lay down some of the issues which have affected human medical ethics and the human protection regimes over the last couple of years. Among others, we have been asking about the importance of the declaration in different regions, for example, in Eastern Europe, Africa, China, and Latin America, and how it's actually being implemented in some of those contexts. So it's really an attempt to contextualize the Declaration of Helsinki, both historically and contemporaneously, in a much broader global framework, what we've attempted here. But let me start with looking at the actual field, the broader aspects. I'm sure they've been discussed many times, but I want to mention them anyway, because I do think they are relevant in some of the discussions we're having. Let us talk about money for a moment. The figures for the global pharmaceutical market are beyond most people's wildest imagination. The revenue generated increased from around 390 billion in 2001 to over 1.1 trillion in 2016, which at that time was the nominal GDP, the gross domestic product of Russia. The main markets, North America, including the United States and Canada, account for almost 50% of the global pharmaceutical market revenue, followed by Europe with 21.5%, Africa and Asia, excluding Japan and Australia, with 16.4%, Japan with 8.3%, and Latin America with 4.7%. So you can see where the global pharmaceutical revenue is generated primarily. And I think that puts things into a little bit of context here when we're also speaking about issues beyond the current vaccination issues. The top 3 world companies are Pfizer, Novartis, and Roche, at least according to these figures, which may already been outdated, but I don't think that, I'm sure that Pfizer is still among the most prominent ones. In 2017, Pfizer sold prescription drugs worth 45.3 billion and invested 7.6 billion into R&D. Novartis sold prescription drugs of 41.8 billion and invested 7.8 billion. Now, for everybody, I guess these are quite staggering figures. And I guess once updated for the sale of COVID vaccines, for some companies at least, they will be eye-watering. Now, one would think that unambiguous, uniform regulations ensuring the safety of participants and continued public confidence in human research would be in everyone's interest. Yet little is further from the truth. We are living in a society or in a global community which, according to Tony Judd, the author of Post-War, is profoundly wrong. And I guess Ruth touched on issues very tangentially, but issues such as vaccine nationalism, vaccine populism, these are issues with which we will have to deal with in the near future. In our world today, as he argues, people no longer ask whether a thing is good, fair, or just, as Chico has outlined, or whether it improves the lives and the health of the many, or whether indeed it is true or untrue. He's arguing that in our world has not only left ideologies, and he means the Cold War ideologies behind, but it has become post-ethical. Now, the post-war world had other ideas and also other hopes. More than 70 years ago, in 1947, the judges in the doctor's trial formulated 10 principles for the ethical conduct of human experiments, which are today known as the Nuremberg Code, and which is probably very familiar to you. Most of you may not be as familiar to the principle 1 about informed consent as they think, because it is extremely comprehensive and, as some have argued, slightly legalistic. Almost 60 years ago, in 1964, the World Medical Association adopted the first version of the Declaration of Helsinki, which I think we all agree is another landmark in the history of biomedical ethics. Yet it is far from certain whether our existing global framework, and here we come to issues which Ruth touched about on, for example, the extent to which some of these guidelines are legally binding, which are clearly not, but nonetheless they are extremely important, whether these guidelines and frameworks are actually sufficient and provide sufficient guidance for tomorrow's research practices. And as we've already seen in the discussions, experts are just becoming aware of the enormous implications and also demands on the current system of research governance, particularly in what is an increasingly confusing research environment, which requires adaptation and near constant reform. And as pointed out very well by some of the participants, we may be looking at another revision of the Declaration of Helsinki in the near future. So the historical and contemporary relevance of both documents offer ample reasons to historicize and reflect for a moment about research ethics more broadly. Now, encouraging medical professionals to reflect about existing and emerging risks involved in medical science was a very long process that required great efforts on the part of experts and organizations such as the WMA. The doctor's trial, which opened in 1946, charged 23 doctors, German doctors and officials with war crimes, crimes against humanity for their involvement in unethical and often lethal camp experiments. The images of the women presented during that trial went around the world. They were testifying and became a recurrent theme in debates about some of the atrocities committed during the Second World War. And what you see here is one of the medical experts in 1946 at the relative start of the trial, called Leo Alexander. He was a Jewish refugee scientist who had emigrated to the United States and then returned back to Germany at the end of the war to investigate some of the crimes which had been committed. And he presents one of the witnesses here from Poland and their particular scars. Following the post-war condemnation of Nazi medical war crimes, the WMA reaffirmed its support for Hippocratic medical ideals in the Declaration of Geneva, and as we've already heard, the very important International Code of Medical Ethics from 1949 originally. Yet at the time, the organization was initially reluctant to extend the discussion further into the field of human experimentation, insofar that it did not really want a more detailed document. However, war crime trials after 1945 contributed to a climate in which public debate about the role of research ethics became inevitable. The harsh sentencing of German scientists, for example, during the Struthof medical trials in the 1950s, prompted the French National Academy of Medicine and the Medico-Juridical Commission of Monaco, which had a mixed membership of lawyers and physicians, to take a firm stand on medical misconduct in clinical research. And they proposed that they might draw up a new code of ethics in human experimentation, which indeed would have legal applicability. Now, by doing that, they set themselves on a collision course at the time with the WMA. Officials made it clear, and I mean WMA officials at the time made it clear that if others, including lawyers, persisted in drafting such a document, and I quote, "This document will not be accepted by the medical profession of the world." So at the time, there was a clear resistance against having others encroaching on what the WMA regarded as their area of competence. Yet by insisting that it was the only moral or legitimate body with the moral authority to draft such a text, the organization found itself under pressure to produce a more authoritative text. Moreover, in continental Europe, at least, the memory of the Holocaust really showed no signs of waning. Delegates such as Lambert Hulst himself, involved in the Dutch resistance and who later became a president of the WMA, raised awareness of the risks involved in clinical research, which at that point was funded with considerable new resources investment in science and technology. Experiments had to be voluntary, he noted, and were only permissible if participants were informed about their right to consent or refuse, he argued. And he called on the WMA to define more clearly the boundaries within which research could be legitimately performed. In the decade after the promulgation of the Nuremberg Code, the ethics of Western research culture underwent a process of profound transformation. It was a period in which ongoing human and civil rights violations went hand in glove with a realization in the field that further resistance to change could lead to damage to the medical profession. By making enormous investments in medicine and science, public agencies in North America and Western Europe had created a situation, as some authors have argued, where the available resources were, quote, greater than the supply of responsible investigators, unquote. By the beginning of the 1960s, in light of ever more frequent revelations about unethical research on vulnerable populations, and after the widely publicized thalidomide tragedy, it was increasingly difficult to oppose the reform of existing research practices. And by 1961, and as you can see here, published in 62, the WMA's Medical Ethics Committee produced what they called a draft code of ethics on human experimentation. This is from October 62. 2 years later, in June 1964, the WMA adopted the declaration during its General Assembly in Helsinki, but not after making last-minute changes. On 14th of June, only days before the inauguration ceremony, the WMA Ethics Committee agreed to change the name of the document from Ethical Principles to Recommendations Guiding Doctors in Clinical Research, thus making the guidelines somewhat less binding for the medical community. The committee also decided to delete clause 3.3c, which states no clinical research should be undertaken when the subject is in a dependent relationship to the investigator, and replace it instead with an addition to clause 4a, which said the investigator must respect the right of each individual to safeguard his personal integrity. Now comes the addition, especially if the subject is in a dependent relationship to the investigator. Within less than 2 hours, the character of the WMA's ethics code, at least in part, had changed. Experiments on institutionalized children, asylum inmates, the psychologically or physically handicapped, or the elderly, while requiring due care and attention, were no longer ruled out. The final version, dated 18th of June, 1964, known as the Declaration of Helsinki, was also silent on the subject of prisoners and vulnerable population. You can see here where the representatives of the Finnish Medical Association are handing over the document to the President of Finland. In the summary of its activities for the year 1964, the WMA hardly mentioned the document at all. I think there are 2 or 3 lines mentioned, but otherwise very little was said. It seems to be that the organization did not anticipate the impact the declaration would have, at least at that point, on biomedical research ethics over the next 50 years. And here, this is the actual document, the typed version of the Declaration of Helsinki, as it is, as we've uncovered it in the Finnish Medical Association archive. So have things improved? Well, I think as we've discussed today already, the jury is still out. Let me give you one example. Peter Lurie mentioned a number of others, but I would wish to just give you one example which I came across during a recent research project. In 2007, the Swiss-based company Novartis commissioned a phase 3 trial with a newly developed bird flu vaccine to be used as a prophylaxis of influenza prior to the outbreak of a pandemic. With the WHO warning about an imminent bird flu pandemic and governments beginning to place orders for vaccine stocks, here was a chance to boost revenue by selling an existing yet modified flu vaccine, provided market approval could be secured quickly. The trial, which had not been authorized by the Polish health authorities, took place at a clinic south of Gdansk. As many as 350 participants, including people from a local homeless shelter and at least 1 pregnant woman, received between €1.40 and €8.30 for testing what they believed to be a conventional flu vaccine. The raised mortality rate among the inmates of the homeless shelter so far could not be have not been conclusively been attributed to the trial. Yet in 2017, so 10 years later, 3 physicians and 6 nurses from that clinic received suspended prison sentences for falsifying documents and misleading participants about the nature of the vaccine. One of the participants at the time recalled, and I quote, "I never agreed to be used as a guinea pig. If I had known what the vaccinations were, I would not have participated," he said. Responding to the allegations, Novartis insisted that it was, quote, "following the research ethics set out in the Declaration of Helsinki." Observers of this case have claimed that the case only presents a tip of the iceberg, shining an unwelcome light onto the impoverished national health services in Eastern Europe. Large-scale Western-funded trials are today an important part of that part of the continent and their economy. Health clinics, doctors, and participants depend on them for additional income and access to medicines. Moral and legal blame, if things go wrong, and as in this case, can easily be apportioned to those running the clinic or to the contract research organization charged with that trial. In 2015, the Novartis company sold its vaccine business to GlaxoSmithKline for $7.8 billion, a move which it might retrospectively have regretted. Today, the world scientific community is engaged in a continuous process of revising the Declaration of Helsinki, which, rather than undermining its authority, as some have argued, aims to ensure that its protective potential for human participants and vulnerable communities can be maintained. It is ultimately one of the most important documents we have. At the same time, and I hope some of the things I've said here today have shown that, we need to recognize that the Declaration is not just a reflection of moral and ethical norms in the field of research ethics, but is in itself a product of medical interest groups who were, at the time at least, determined to implement a carefully phrased, codified regulation as a way to legitimize the continued use of humans in experimental trials across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Chieko, shall we invite Dr. Ramin?
Yes, yes, it is very interesting discussion, the lecture, and it is very nice to be able to request comments from WMA. It's a historical development of the Declaration of Helsinki. And very much interesting that you connect the issue of some kind of pandemic in historical context. So,
who would you like to speak?
So please.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and thank you to Ulf Schmidt for a very interesting presentation. And I think that what it tells us is that it always, and the research ethics has to be seen in the background of the contemporary development that you have seen. So it's not an isolated. And when you go to vaccine research, for instance, well, if somebody would do an experiment as Jenna had done it before, you simply would go to prison nowadays. So it would not be acceptable. Yet at the time being, it was a breakthrough, or at least a scientific evaluation of what was happening in wild inoculation experiments that were going on in Great Britain, for instance. Yet it is very clear as well that we had setbacks in the ethical standards, or in the application of ethical standards, for instance, during the Third Reich, but not only there, also in other countries. Tuskegee is one of the examples that has been used for sterilizations in Europe that have been done long into the 70s. Discrimination against certain groups, which have been going on even in rich countries. Think of Hansen's disease, until in our time now. And yet, I think I would like to remain a strong advocate of the physician group itself, being the driver of this development, because it's taking responsibility for what we are doing. And it is correct, and I agree with Professor Schmidt, certainly the weight that we have put in the Declaration of Helsinki has shifted quite a bit from enabling research in the beginning, making research possible and acceptable, to the patient protection, or the protection aspect in the declaration. It's not only about patients, it's about the subjects participating in the research. And this protection aspect is, again, then itself a double aspect. It's against those who are subjected to the research. It's also for those who are participating in the research as active participants, like researchers and physicians in there. So these aspects have certainly shifted. There is much more cognizance. There is much more difference to or distance that has developed to, for instance, the industry during this time. So the closeness to industry in the 50s and the 60s was much, much bigger than it certainly is now, which does not mean that we think there is not a reason for cooperation, for discussion, and for integration. I think everybody who has a legitimate interest of being part of a healthcare system must also have a voice at the table and must be included. But nevertheless, I think we see this with much more distance right now. The question whether the guideline or the principles are sufficient, which you raised quite clearly, no, they are never sufficient. Sufficient is the ethical behavior that is being used along this guideline and is been exercised along this guideline. The guideline itself is certainly never sufficient enough. It's just one tool in the application of experimentation and medical practice in general. So there is no guarantee by any guideline. It cannot be for the question of applicability, of enforceability, and the completeness of the guideline, because we all know the moment we have accepted a new version of the Declaration of Helsinki or any other guideline in that context, the next moment we know already the deficits of that, because we are learning that there are mistakes, we are learning that there are gaps, and certainly that is something that always asks us to retake ownership of this process and retake responsibility for its development, which I think is as important as the document itself. The moment we stop working on it and thinking on it, I think we lose the ownership, and it also loses its relevance to medicine. On the other side, I think we also can be proud of it. There has been no other professional group which has taken this leadership, although there could have some, especially coming from our own country, from Germany, thinking about the jurisprudence and this group, but also many other groups like artists, technicians, other researchers who have not taken this challenge and have not taken this responsibility as we have. So I think there is also quite some pride we can take in this development, although nothing is perfect and nothing has come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Pasapalsi, do you have some comment?
Thank you, Kyoko. Well, actually, I think Ottmar said it all. I would like to echo that it is the ethical behavior that indeed counts, not the guidelines per se, if they're sufficient or not. At the same time, if we see that the ethical behavior is not the way we would like them to be, then maybe we probably need adjustments there in the guidelines, make them stricter, make them clearer. And that's what Ottmar also mentioned. These ethical principles are always work in progress. The moment we have just approved one, we basically have to start working on them again. And we always have to make sure that they are up to the challenges of our current times. It was extremely interesting to hear the historical overview, because we can also learn very much of that. I was actually, I didn't know the small fact that the ethical principles, they were called recommendations at some point, and then back to ethical principles. I'm not even sure in what year it was called again, ethical principles. That would be interesting to know. I don't know if Ottmar or Ulf know this piece of information, but I really enjoyed your presentation, Ulf. Thank you very much. And yeah, I can only say that this work in progress is exciting. And if we look what many parts of the DOH also say, we have to take great care that there's no abuse of certain of these regulations. And if there are, we have to look again into them. And we had a few examples today where we probably have to revisit certain paragraphs. And thank you so much for this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Schumi, do you have some response?
Thank you very much for the comments. I fully agree with both Dr. Ramin Parsa and obviously also with Professor Kloiber. I think they're both absolutely right that ultimately no guideline and no law, no regulation, however strict, can prevent, if scientists are bent on violating ethical principles, none of these guidelines will do that. So it is ultimately the ethical behavior, and it's the awareness, I think, which is fundamental. And I think probably all of us here today agree that the Declaration of Helsinki is one of the most important documents, and having created an awareness over the various decades in the scientific community. So in a sense, what we may, when we look at it historically, see as potentially some of the weaknesses of the documents are in fact some of its strengths. Because what it requires the international medical community to find consensus. And it is only through this consensus that the document has that reach across the globe. And I think where I see the greatest strengths of the document is that doctors and researchers do not want to be, and this is the important word here, they don't want to be seen to breaching the Declaration of Helsinki. This is not about the extreme cases where someone violates intentionally something. This is more how organizations and research communities wish to be seen. That is an important leverage which this document has, and also the organization. And I think it has fulfilled that over the last 50 years with tremendous diplomacy and great skill.
So, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed your presentation, because that, as Dr. Kloiber said, that WMS documents is very much focused on the doctor-patient relationship in very small consulting room. But in its historical development, there are many events of the public health issue, as you said, in the issue of flu, the development of the pharmaceutical companies' activity. This is very much interesting. Thank you very much. And I would like to have some comments from the audience. After that, if it is possible, I'd like to ask for comments from the Professor Kimura, because we are going to some historical discussion, and the Professor Kimura played a very important role of developing the bioethics principles with Beecham and naturalists, and also he participated in the first version of the SIOMS guideline. So, Professor Kimura, would you please Professor McLean? Yeah.
Maybe you covered it in some other sessions. Camera here. Okay. But what I'm missing here,
Professor McLean?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
I thought I was hearing somebody else. Yes. I question whether the FDA requires placebo-controlled trials. Peter Lurie mentioned one case in which there were placebo-controlled trials for the mother-to-child transmission, and another study that was approved by the FDA that was a non-inferiority study. And there are many non-inferiority studies that are being conducted. My understanding is that it is the pharmaceutical industry that wants to have placebo-controlled trials, partly because they're cheaper to conduct, partly because they can get answers in a shorter period of time and therefore get FDA approval and therefore start making money. So I really question whether the FDA is driving it. Now, it is true that the US FDA approves a lot of placebo-controlled trials, but that's not the same as saying that they restrict trials or that they refuse protocols that are not placebo-controlled. So that's my answer to that. I did also want to ask Dr. Kloiber, who commented that the next version of the Declaration of Helsinki perhaps should make explicit mention of prevention trials. And I was wondering what he had in mind and what's needed that the current Declaration of Helsinki does not provide by way of an understanding of prevention trials. Thank you.
So Dr. Kloiber, could you respond?
Yes, let me respond to two things about the placebo trials and the request by the authorities. I think I share the view of Dr. Macklin that I would expect just from the logic of the finances and the material problems that it is in the interest of the sponsor of a trial to reduce the numbers, and the numbers you can reduce by having a very strong comparator, which gives a very clear result, which usually is easier with a placebo than with another drug. So I would be surprised if the authorities are drivers for placebo arms, although there may be compelling reasons to do so, especially with symptomatic treatment, where you really can argue that there are good reasons for one or the other question in a smaller arm, for instance, to test against a placebo, where there are good reasons to do so. I'm Dr. Macklin, I'm not sure that there will be a change in the Declaration of Helsinki. What I would like to see is that we really look into the questions of prevention research. One of the very important questions is the distinction of vulnerable groups and actually the targeted groups of prevention research. And there is a tension in the Declaration of Helsinki, which makes the research in vulnerable groups very difficult, while at the same time, some of the research, especially the prevention research, targets the vulnerable groups explicitly. I'm not sure that it is needed to change it, but I think we have to discuss this and we have to ask for this. And that is what I'm arguing for. I'm by no means sure that there will be a change to that, but certainly there should be a discussion about it. And we should have awareness about it. That I think is important, as there has to be awareness, for instance, about other parts of the Declaration of Helsinki, which have come under stress, so to speak, with the corona pandemic. For instance, the compassionate use of unproven drugs and their extensive use in some countries, which some of the people argued with the Declaration of Helsinki, which I think is completely untrue. But nevertheless, I think we have to ask the questions and have to discuss it. Will this lead to a change in the declaration? I don't know. We will find out.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Luli and Dr. Greco is raising the hand. So please, would you give your comment, Dr. Luli?
I would prefer that Peter Lurie speaks before me, because I want to make just a kind of review of what has been said. So
okay. So before that, I'd like Professor Kimura. Would you? Is it possible for you? Dr. Luli and Professor Kimura, and then Professor Greco. Is it all right? So please, Dr. Luli.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to respond a little bit to Ruth's excellent point about what the FDA requires. And it's interesting, in the course of this conversation, I did in fact send an email to a former colleague of mine who's the head of vaccines at FDA and asked him if that is still the case. And hopefully I'll get an answer, and who knows, maybe in the next half hour, in which case I'll share it with you. I rather doubt it. So, I've seen this from kind of both sides as an advocate, who resisted placebo controls in a certain set of circumstances, and as an official who worked at FDA for a while. And I think that Ruth's description is accurate. I think it slightly understates what the FDA's preference is. I think the FDA's preference, of course, it depends on the exact situation, but broadly, there's a lot of sympathy for the power of placebo-controlled trials. And certainly some of the people who have resisted the critique against placebo-controlled trials have been either present or former FDA officials. But that is not to say that they won't accept something else. They may have a preference, but that doesn't mean they won't accept something else. And if you were to show up with a non-inferiority trial that without question showed that you were as effective as Moderna or Pfizer, I cannot imagine that the FDA would turn that down in the current context. That seems unlikely to me, as long as it was reasonably well designed. So I think that the ethical question for us is not simply to point in the direction of regulatory agencies, but to ask ourselves as individuals, as people who pride ourselves in the ethical conduct of research, what we should be advocating for. And to take a stand and not simply point at what other people are saying, even the declaration for that matter. And there, I think the example that I gave about the situation in Thailand is really instructive. You'll remember that I said that there were 16 trials that had been done, one of which did not include a placebo-controlled trial. And we were able to obtain documents about the debate within the National Institutes of Health in the United States, which ended up funding the study, in which they repeatedly resisted the idea of a non-inferiority trial over and over again. And the researchers at Harvard went back to them over and over again and insisted that the use of the placebo would be unethical. There were probably 2 or 3 back and forth over this. And eventually the NIH went along with a different design. And the then director of the NIH, Harold Varmus, even testified before Congress that, this is almost verbatim, there are different ways of answering a question. And that's right, there are different ways. And, it's for us to advocate for the most ethical way. So again, I think strong advocacy can get these authorities who may be rigid, to begin with, to accept more ethically designed trials.
Thank you very much. So it's an important point. So may I ask Professor Kimura for your comments? Sorry, mute, please. Mute it. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed for all the speakers' presentation today. I was very much impressed by all the speakers. Ruth, you mentioned about the COVAX Global Initiative. That might be a good example for the accomplishment of some bioethical principles. You have any ideas on the bioethical comments relating to COVAX Global Initiatives? That is my first question. The second, please. Yes.
Second question. Yeah.
My second question is Dr. Schmidt. I really appreciate your very clear statement on the issues of clinical research, and including the ideas on the Nuremberg Code, which was implemented by the World Medical Association. And in the case of Japan, I'm very sorry to say, I mean, I feel very sorry to say this, but because of this very negative experience in China, in Manchuria, for the human experimentation during the war by the special unit 731, which had the almost similar experimentation or more severe experimentation on humans, particularly against Manchurian and Chinese. And these kind of criminal, case by the Japanese military medical corps are not really open even for the Japanese. I wrote this case, Unit 731 case, in the Encyclopedia of Bioethics, edited by Warren Reich. I think that was the first kind of public comments in bioethical perspective on this human experimentation by the Japanese military corps. And then many Japanese professionals, medical professionals, are saying that this is jintai jiken, human experimentation, which can be permitted in that critical situation because all these prisoners are anyway going to die. And then in the last moment, they they could be used for the subject of medical research and so on. I wrote these issues in the Encyclopedia of Bioethics. And then some years ago, in 1992, SIOMS had this ethics and research on human subject. This was done in 1992, and I have written the Asian perspectives on human experimentation. And in this paper, I quoted by this military very cruel human experimentation against Chinese and Manchurians. And then we are not, I mean, the Japanese medical experts are not called to the criminal court or war court like in Nuremberg because of the American intervention. Because American military medical expert wanted to keep the document so that everything should be in secret. And then all the medical expert who has done this medical crime had been immune because of this American intervention, and all this medical experimentation data has been transferred to military medical corps in the United States. I have found a document in the US National Archives in Suitland, Maryland, to find out that they are dealing with the Japanese criminals, medical criminals, in making this secret agreement with the Japanese expert, particularly with the head of this corps called General Ishii. And this was really scandal. And then officially, this was not recognized as a crime by the Japanese government. And many of the Japanese medical experts are saying, oh, it's war because of the war. And it's happened. And then we have to proceed because science is advancing and so on and so on. So it's a kind of great difference between Germany and Japan. And then I have found a secret note on the paper saying that American examiner in Japan at that time wrote a kind of comment by using his pencil, that saying that we are doing a Nuremberg military trial against German medical expert, and almost all of them, around 18 people, were sentenced death by hang. And this examiner in Japan, military expert, said, well, we are doing in Germany and we are doing this in Japan, and maybe later years, this will cause some big trouble and so on. It's pencil wrote in such a way. So this is really very big scandal, and this is not shared yet officially by the Japanese medical expert. That is one of the most important bioethical issues in Japan. And I think we need to clarify these issues before doing bioethics. And there are no such a kind of statement in many bioethics books recently. Rather recently, I think because of my influence, there has been some of the textbook writing about this fact and document. So my question to Dr. Schmidt is, how did you know? I mean, you must know the Japanese case, and how did you interpret this kind of treatment with American and Japanese military expert, medical expert, and immuned these Japanese by the American forces? Quite a big scandal. I think, Dr. Schmidt, did you know about this? And then you have any comments on this kind of issues? But first, I think I'd like to get some short answer from Ruth about your interpretation of the COVAX Global Initiative. Is there any bioethical implications of this organization? How do you think about this?
So please.
I go first, or I can be brief, actually. This was one of the first, as in my understanding, this was one of the first attempts to get some kind of global cooperation in a medical situation. And it's very clear, this may be one of the first, it's at least one of the few, but one of the first examples of a real pandemic. I mean, there have been other pandemics. They have been milder diseases or diseases that were more readily controlled. But this is a wake-up call. And what's needed now is some kind of new alliance, not just the World Health Organization and these other two organizations, which I'm not criticizing, I'm commending what they were trying to do, but it doesn't involve the kind of global cooperation that's needed to do something that might stem the tide of any future pandemic. And those are not unheard of. I mean, what I've heard from scientists or read from scientists basically is that this may just be the tip of the iceberg or a wake-up call for the future. We have all those variants out there, and there may be other possibilities. This is connected actually to the question of the origins of the current pandemic. And although that's a very controversial issue and it goes beyond this seminar, this webinar that we're having, there is now at least some evidence, but very small evidence, that something escaped from that laboratory in Wuhan. And there's no way to get to the bottom of that. The WHO effort to try to inquire about that with Chinese cooperation absolutely failed, because the Chinese group that was part of the inquiry were in control of the inquiry and control of the results. So what's really needed is an indication that there is global cooperation, because there were a lot of Chinese people who died, and a pandemic can start anywhere. So I think the need for global cooperation, this pandemic is a wake-up call, and it needs more than 3 organizations getting together with the World Health Organization.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So, Professor Schmidt, so could you respond?
Yes, thank you very much for those comments and questions. Particularly, I'd like to thank Dr. Kimura for a very important issue he's raising in this context here. I think as historians or scholars who are interested in broader political and governmental histories, we are all aware that we always need to contextualize certain events in their particular context. And as you rightly pointed out, the time period we're talking about here is the immediate post-war period, in which there was an emerging, as scholars generally call it, a Cold War period. And I think you are absolutely correct in what you highlighted here, that there were very different ways of investigating and prosecuting and also remembering the different war crimes. And the war crimes which the German scientists had been conducted were quite publicly being presented to the world, and they've been discussed and remembered over the years. And that is not the same as with other cases, as you highlighted in the case of Japanese, particularly the biological war experiments to which you alluded to. Now, obviously, scholars have also more recently looked into those tests and experiments. I can refer you, in addition to your own work, to Till Berninghausen, who written a chapter in a book we published in 2007 on the Japanese biological warfare experiments on human subjects in China, and more recently, Jean Guillaumin, who's a scholar from the United States, who has written a book called Hidden Atrocities, also dealing with the history of which was going on in Japan. And she actually looked at, as you rightly said, the records for the trials and the records of the Japanese scientists. They were actually transferred after the war to the United States. The reason being was that the United States wanted to make sure that any potential relevant or useful data which came out of these experiments could be used during the Cold War. That is still the period where the United States military is actively involved in developing a biological weapons potential. So that is one of the contextual information which is important to understand, why so much, in a sense, was brought to the United States at the time, and also has led possibly to less publicity and also remembering of these experiments to which you quite rightly highlighted. One other comment I just wanted to briefly mention, which I thought because I think it's an important point, which Ruth mentioned earlier in one of the chats. She asked, has there ever been, or has there been sanctions for violations of the Declaration of Helsinki? And I think it's it's an important point here to raise. This is obviously goes beyond an organization or association like the World Medical Association. And if it happens, when these sanctions do happen in one way or another, they often happen or seem to be happening away from the public eye. And I wish to give you one example, namely the example of the Novartis case, which I highlighted in my brief presentation. What happened was that the actual application, which was submitted to the European Medical Association at the time, had to be withdrawn. And it had to be withdrawn because the EMAs began to do an investigation after they were informed that something had not gone quite according to plan. And the protocol of that, in a sense, all the unethical information about these tests are hidden away in what's called a withdrawal assessment report, which no one would find and no one would read if you wouldn't know about it. You can find it. It is on the EMA website, but it is one of many reports. It is so inconspicuous. But once you read it carefully, you realize what actually was going on and why this particular trial was highly unethical. And the conclusion which the EMA made was that the Novartis had, quote, failed to provide adequate quality oversight of the study. And they detailed that with a number of details, for example, that there had been serious ethical shortcomings, including the inclusion of vulnerable populations in the trial, inadequate medical record keeping, changes in the inclusion criteria without appropriate approval by the relevant government authorities, and so on. So in a sense, what you are absolutely right, Ruth, there are cases but they're not publicized and hardly known among the global community unless they are being highlighted. I hope that at least is a comment to your important point.
Thank you very much. So before asking Dr. Greco's comment, there is one person raised her hand, Sander. Sander, could you give your comments very shortly? He's a working group of chair of our ethics working group of IFA.
Thank you very much. I shall be very short. I would like to come back to the discussion regarding placebo control and the support by the regulatory authorities, the medical profession, and the pharmaceutical industry. There was a very interesting symposium once about the use of placebo in which medical and industry expert and regulatory expert came together. And finally, it turned out that mostly the placebo control was supported by the regulatory agency. And his argument was the following, and this is what I want to comment on, that the regulatory authority, the decision of the regulatory authority will affect millions of people. So they have to be, their responsibility is much higher than the responsibility of the individual doctors or of the factory, because if they make a bad decision because the control was not adequate or because there was no placebo control, this would affect millions of billions of people. So I think when we discuss that problem, we should also consider the largeness of the responsibility of the decision makers. And this is, I think, a very important point. And this is probably what will explain why the regulatory authorities are much more supportive of placebo control, which gives them real safety for their decision. That is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, and congratulations for the symposium.
Thank you very much for your very important comments. So we wish to discuss more, but the time is the closing time is coming. So we would like to ask the, Professor Greco's comments for closing and appreciation for the audience.
Well, thank you, Kyoko. Thank you for all of you presented. I had many things to say, but it's almost noon here, so it's almost midnight for you in Japan. So I'm going to be short. And the first thing is about that all documents usually are written and decided by the winners. Nuremberg is a good case because the decision was just to see what they want to do with Germany. But I want to remind you that at the same time, from 1932 to 1972, Americans were doing wrong things with their own people, and that was Tuskegee. Nothing happened to those people. And at the same time, from 1946 to 48, those same people were in Guatemala doing experiments with syphilis in people that lived in Guatemala. It's a history, and people have been using that as a history. So it's a very hard for us, especially for myself being in an underdeveloped country, to have a word. And for us, even worse, as like Japanese, who speaks Portuguese? Who does speak Japanese outside Japan? So it's not written in English, people just forget about it. So that's just a point, a provocation to all of us, and see how do we really face things in a way that should be ethical. It depends on who is winning. What I want to thank Kyoko to open this opportunity for me to have at least 5 minutes in the end. First of all, to thank everyone to stay to the end of this first meeting. But I want to comment just a little bit on Kyoko's points, and I thought was very stimulating. One of my questions was answered about the justice. I didn't understand that quite right, but I hope that we can talk about that later, about not having a test in Japan, but that's something that we can do later. But she was very strict, and Ruth, we have a history. So many years of being together with Peter Lurie also. We discussed this, all of this. It's a deja vu. We have been discussing the same thing over and over again. And in my point of view, this is a dated discussion. We have to discuss how people have to have access, all of us, all of them, to what's coming from research, and not only the post-trial access to people that are very much secure by being in a research project. But I liked Ruth, I always liked her, and I say that here, I say that when we meet. She's clear, she's objective, she was very strong in her points. And I quite agree with the criticism about WHO and the New England Journal of Medicine publications. I have mentioned to you, but I'm now part of the ACTA from COVAX. There's a working group on ethics, and I belong to this group. We're 12 people. But those people that decided to write a paper saying that they're experts, and worst of all, with someone from WHO signing, that was not responsible. And of course, I'm completely against what the conclusions were. On post-trial provisions, Ruth did not mention that, but especially in WMA, it says, I don't remember if WMA or CIOMS, make provisions. What does it mean, make provisions to something? It has to be ensured. Make provisions could be anything. Yeah, we're going to do it. So that's the thing that we have to think about changing. And the patent waive, we didn't talk much about that, but I think it's something that we have to discuss all the time, not only for this epidemic, because other epidemics are coming. We have to have a way of making people can have access to things that are produced, especially with the vaccines now. If you look, and Ruth can say that much more strictly than I am, the warp speed thing that the last president of the United States planned, they invested $8 billion, $18 billion in the pharmaceutical industry. How can they have that much profit now after that? And with Peter, I mentioned that before. It's we have a intense history in that. We published on something from FDA in 2005. It was in Lancet, discussing the decision of the FDA to taking out the Declaration of Helsinki from their requirement for some kind of projects that came outside the United States. So all these things we have been discussing, but there's one thing that I did not quite agree with Peter, and I mentioned to him in the chat, is the summary in the end. Every time someone says it's a case-to-case basis, I get bumps, because that means that you can do things if you do it case by case. I'm sure you're not meaning that, but I think we have to be very careful when you say that. And of course, we have a history also since 5-10 years ago, no, 12, 14, when you decided to write this beautiful book, and I was very pleased and honored to be part of it. And you said something that I'm very concerned about. The first one is that we're living in a post-ethical world. And that's true. Everything goes. People say, well, that's the way the things are. People are going to suffer, people are going to die, people are going to be poor, people are going to be vulnerable. And so what can we do? And Ruth and I think Peter, and then now it was mentioned that these declarations are not binding. No, they're not binding at all. And that's what happened in Brazil when the decision was to change the Declaration of Helsinki from 2000 to 2008. Brazil decided that we have specific laws to govern research. In Brazil, you cannot use placebo unless those conditions are very clear. And post-trial access, it's written that it has no time limit. And someone mentioned that the industry is going to have problem by paying that. That's completely out of, can you imagine? They spend so much money carrying doctors from place to place in first-class planes. The money is not a problem. So Brazil decided that, and that was a big pressure against it, saying that people are not going to be doing research in Brazil after that. Of course, they're still doing it, because for them, they can change anything. They're just chameleons. They change it, and Brazil is different from other countries. And I think we're finishing. I think I used my more than 5 minutes. I hope the next week we can speak a lot on post-trial access. And I'm going to be very strong saying that post-trial access is to all. We have to change from research that's very controlled to a public health situation. Everyone has to have access to that. And last but not least, I mentioned that to Dr. Kyoko in our discussion in Japan 2 years before, because when I was visiting Hiroshima, that's amazing. Hiroshima made me almost cry to see what happened there. And I saw a big board saying that the Americans decided just after the war to open a place where they could receive people that were affected by the bomb. They had, everyone came because they thought they were going to be treated. But no, the Americans want to follow them up and see what the natural history. That is 1947. So all these are happening throughout the world, and we have to be very keen and very clear that we have to emancipate ourselves to make sure that all these things cannot pass. Disparity is not something that has to be forever. It's very hard to change, but we can change. Kyoko, thanks very much. I congratulate you because most of the work for these 2 societies that participated was your work and the group from Japan. And we are very pleased to be with you. And I hope that next week we're going to have another good meeting. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So there are many, many things that we want to continue discussion, but the time is very late at night in Japan. And so I thank you very much, Japanese audience, especially to stay until this time at midnight. So thank you very much for everyone for your participation. And next week at the same time, Friday, June 11th, we start the next discussion, especially focus on post-trial access. And the speakers are mainly from developing countries. It is a very good opportunity to listen to these people's talks and discussion. So thank you very much. See you again next week. Bye-bye.